The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
In 1980, I was transferred again, and I was transferred to the airport in Toronto. And to many, that would not have been an appealing transfer, but it stands out to me as an incredible opportunity because I was back in uniform. And not only was I back in uniform in Toronto, but I was at the largest Canadian airport and a city within itself. And I was a sergeant in charge of a 20-person shift, patrol sergeant. And I was on patrol every day and every night through the airport in Toronto. And it brought me right back to my days of walking the beat in Burnaby in 1965, meeting people, dealing with stressful situations, lost people, misplaced cars, lost property, family disputes at the airport, sudden deaths, all of the things that police officers meet in downtown Mississauga are met at the airport in Toronto. And it was supposed to have been a 3-year term. I asked to be extended for a 4th year because I loved the nature of the work. I loved being in uniform. I loved the foot patrols, and I loved working with my shift. So in 1984, by 1984, I had spent 4 years at the airport, and I had 20 years service. And I was a sergeant. And I began to wonder what did the future hold for Sergeant Healy. And a curve came from an unexpected source, and it was announced that Canada would host a papal visit. And so I was transferred from the airport in 1984 to St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Toronto. And I worked with another colleague, a staff sergeant, and we were posted to an office inside the residence at the cathedral at St. Michael's, and which is the largest cathedral in Toronto. And we prepared for the papal visit. The RCMP established a papal task force in 1984, and I don't think it's an exaggeration when I say that every police officer in Ontario was employed in some way with the papal visit, whether it be motorcade or building security or crowd control, because it was the first papal visit. And John Paul II was a world-known figure, and it was a class of VIP visit that had never been measured by the RCMP. So it was a super huge responsibility. Namibia broke away from South Africa, and they wanted to establish a new police force, and so I was selected in 1991 to go to Namibia, along with a colleague from England, and the two of us were selected by our countries to help train the new Namibian police. The British police officer and I decided that he would, to a large degree, be responsible for the training of the new officer corps, and that I would be responsible for the recruitment and the training of the new recruit police officers to Namibia. The thing that impressed me again and again in Namibia was the similarities at the training school to what I had seen at Depot. They had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new applicants, and these were all young black men and women, new into policing, new into Windhoek, coming from small towns and villages throughout the country, all hoping to join policing and to make their country better. So it was just another great rewarding experience of training trainers to train their own and introduce concepts of democracy. It was while I was working in Africa that another request came from the Czech Republic in Eastern Europe. And so I was selected in 1994 to go to the Czech Republic, to Prague, and work with the Czech police. Now, just a few years earlier, the Czech police had separated from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had become divided into states, and so the Czech Republic and Slovakia had separated. The old Czechoslovakia became two states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so the Czech Republic was the first country to write to Canada through diplomatic channels and ask for help, doing essentially what the African countries had been doing in community policing. So I was selected to go to the Czech Republic for a year, and I lived in Prague, and I worked with a colonel in the Czech police. And what he would do is deposit me in various training schools throughout the Czech Republic, or in units, in police units around the country. And I would teach my stories about democratic policing. So both the Czech Republic and Slovakia in particular were two countries that were in severe evolution and changing fast. It was quite a privilege for me to go there, as well as, and take other police officers with me to talk to criminal analysts and the drug units and the traffic units and the investigators about how their country was evolving. So even before I had retired, I had taken an interest in history of the force. And so one night, my wife and I, Kathy and I, were out walking in the local cemetery, and we came to her grandfather's grave, and Kathy's grandfather had been a member of the RCMP in the 1950s, 25 years. And there he was, buried, but there was no indication on his gravestone that he had once been a member of the force. And I said to Kathy, it's sad that you and I know that your grandfather was a member of the force, but because there's an absence of the crest of the force, any other person walking by would not know. And so we began to think about the possibility of recording as many the names of as many members as possible that we knew that were buried in Notre Dame Cemetery in Ottawa. And so over the next couple of weeks, Kathy and I put a list together of 200 people, 200 members that we found their gravestones in Ottawa, in Orleans, and in Kanata. And Kathy and I began to think about a registry. Record these people's names and the location of their graves, And so I began a very primitive database on WordPerfect and started to record 200 names of men and women who had died either during the force, during their career, or after they retired. And so shortly after, I'm at an AGM, an annual general meeting of the vets, and I happen to be sitting beside another vet from Toronto. And he and I are in Kelowna, of all places. And we happen to be at the same table. And he said to me, "Joe, what are you doing in your spare time?" And I said, "Well, I've taken an interest in recording all of the graves in Ottawa that we can find of retired members who have passed away." And he said, "Well, by coincidence, I'm doing the same thing in Toronto." He said, "I'll give you all of my names after I go back to Toronto." So sure enough, a week or so later, he sends me his list, and then I'm up to 500 names. I had 500 names on this primitive list of deceased members who had either been buried in Toronto or in the Ottawa area. Well, then Jack O'Reilly, my friend that I had met in Kelowna, called the vets in Kingston and said, "Joe Healy up in Ottawa is maintaining an Ontario list of our vets." And so the vets in Kingston sent me 75 names. Well, the whole idea exploded. And within a very short time, the vets in New Brunswick, in J Division, heard about what I was doing, and they sent me 275 names. Well, then I realized I was in trouble because my primitive way of recording these graves wasn't sufficient. So I went to a database expert, and he taught me how to record the names in a legitimate database. And I began to advertise through vets who became my volunteers about what I was doing. And within a very short time, I was up to 2,000 names of graves that vets knew where these deceased members were buried. And so New Brunswick came online, J Division vets came online, then H Division, Nova Scotia came online. Prince Edward Island has 100 graves of members who are buried there, and they came online. And then vets in the West started to hear about what I was doing.
How many are you up to now?
So now I'm up to 22,300 names of deceased going back to 1873. And I have an incredible network of vets and volunteers and family members, coast to coast, who every day send me either a photograph of a grave. We have about 6,500 graves found, located and cared for, and 22,300 deceased. Now, what's interesting about this is that there were a little over 300 members on the March West, 1874. And of those 300 members, we've located nearly all of them in Canada or in America. So for the first time, we now have, we've been able to find all of their graves, which had never been done. And through the creation of this database, I've established a website, and I've gone live through the website worldwide, which gives everyone access to the database, and so they can immediately tell who is deceased, where they're deceased, and whether or not we have a photograph of their grave and whether or not it's been cared for. So the March West, the caring for the graves of the March West was a goal that we set years ago. And we actually know that there were more than 300 members on the March West. There were more like 317 members on the March West. And with the rare exception of a couple members who were drowned and whose bodies have not been recovered, we have found 99% of all the grave sites of all of the members on the March West. The other goal that we set for ourselves was somewhat similar. We wanted to identify all the graves of the members on the honor roll. There are 231 members on the RCMP honor roll. Many of those members were shot and killed on duty, and many were in tragic car accidents, and many members drowned. Of the 231 members on the honor roll, we have found 225 graves. Not only found them, but now we've got flags posted out there on their graves, and their graves are being looked after. We know where the other 6 graves are, but in those cases, the ashes are being cared for by members' families, and they haven't been buried yet. So we've been able to, in addition to identifying all the grave locations of members who naturally pass away, we earmarked the March West and the members on the honor roll, and with rare exception, we've been able to find all of their graves, ensure they've all been cared for, manicured, the lawns are cut. We're moving to ensure that the etching on the graves are legible so that people can read. We're establishing funding so that we can get the crest of the force on as many graves as we can. And the website and the database has become a remarkable testament to deceased members of the force. And it's one of a kind in the world, that is within the police universe. The website is divided into 3 major parts. There is the website itself, there is the database, and there is the blog. The website is dedicated to stories about members of the force who have done some pretty remarkable things in policing in Canada. The database is the information deposit for all of the graves in Canada and around the world. And the blog is a daily reminder of a grave that has been found most recently. So I put one grave up every day on the blog. Coming back to your question, Canadians will be reminded when they look at the website at the numbers of men and women who have given their lives for Canada in the World Wars. So in the Northwest Rebellion, there were many members killed in the early settlement of Canada. And then Canada sent members to South Africa in 1900 for what's commonly referred to as the Boer Wars. And then members went to World War I. And then members went to World War II. And members have died, as I said earlier, in peacekeeping. And so I've been able now to identify all of the members who were killed in the Northwest Rebellion, the members who were killed in South Africa, and we've been able to find photographs of the graves of these members who have been killed abroad. And I wanted to mention at the start at how many hundreds of members had been killed overseas in the Great Wars and who didn't come home, but instead are buried in Europe. And so I've been able to identify all the members in World War I and World War II. But going back to a very, very famous story in the RCMP, and that's the story of the so-called Mad Trapper in the Arctic in 1930. And it so happened that a lone man wandered into the Arctic back in 1930, and he was a very surly, odd character. And when he was met by the RCMP, he was not in any way polite or endearing, but very, very secretive and not forthcoming with who he was. And so he was labeled by folklore as the Mad Trapper. As it turned out, he shot one of our members and then eventually shot and killed another member, and then shot and wounded a member of the armed forces who was a part of the search party looking for him back in the early 1930s. Well, the inspector in charge of the search team at that time was a young inspector by the name of Ames, Alexander Ames. And Inspector Ames had a very colorful history in the sense that he was from Wales. He came to Canada, joined the force, was recognized very early in his career as being an above average academic type. His penmanship, his writing style, his academic knowledge was above average. And so he was commissioned at a very early age. And after spending time policing around the prairie provinces, was sent to the Arctic. Now, in those days, there were only 11 members in the Arctic. And so when this Mad Trapper character came to the attention of the RCMP, it was Inspector Ames that was the officer commanding of the Arctic Sub at that time. And reports began to filter into his office about this character. And Inspector Ames instructed our members to go back and talk to this man and find out what his intentions were, what his location was going to be during the cold winter months, so that if there were an emergency, that he would be able to be given supplies and contacted. Well, it was during one of these contacts that the Mad Trapper shot Constable King and wounded him, and Constable King had to be transported by dog team back to the hospital to be, and his life was saved. But after he shot another member and killed him, Inspector Ames organized a search party. And after 7 weeks, the Mad Trapper was successfully corralled by the RCMP, and there was a gunfight involved, and the Mad Trapper was killed in the gunfight by Inspector Ames and by the search party. And one of the members of the search party was this member of the armed forces that had been recruited to help the RCMP. So after the Mad Trapper, it was never identified, but it has become a famous Canadian story because he led the RCMP on a 7-week chase across the Arctic before he was finally captured. And there was the fear that he might cross the border into Alaska and get beyond the reach of the RCMP before he was arrested. After that, Inspector Ames was transferred back to the Prairie Provinces and spent some time as a superintendent in Yorkton Sub. And then eventually he was transferred to Nova Scotia. Inspector Ames rose to assistant commissioner, and he was the commanding officer of Nova Scotia in 1946. And it was in 1946 that he retired. And after retirement, Assistant Commissioner Ames and his wife moved to Vancouver to enjoy their retirement. And I was able to learn that in retirement, he enjoyed traveling around British Columbia, visiting old cronies and talking about his days in the force, starting back in the 1920s. So, Assistant Commissioner Ames died in 1964, just at the time that just about the same time that I arrived in Burnaby. And strangely, after he died, he was cremated, but his body or his remains were forgotten. And they were left in the funeral home in Burnaby, BC, for 47 years. So one of my volunteers from Calgary was sending me information on obituaries from Alberta and the Calgary, Edmonton area. And one day he sent me an obituary, and he said to me, Joe, he said, you know, this is the strangest case. He said, you know, I've been able to track Inspector Ames all his career, And he had spent time in the Alberta area, but he said, you know, I can't find his grave. And it would seem, given his career and what he had done, that he would be buried in Alberta. Well, as it turned out, he wasn't buried in Alberta. He had retired with his wife in the Vancouver area, and when he died, he had been cremated. So I worked with my volunteer, Mr. Healy, in Calgary, and I said, Reg, we've got to find Assistant Commissioner Ames. I said, he's a famous character, you know. He not only had a colorful career, but he was the inspector at the time in charge of the Mad Trapper chase and the eventual death of the Mad Trapper. So Reg was able to, because of the help of the computer, was able to find the death certificate of Assistant Commissioner Ames, and he found out that he died in Vancouver. Well, then I got the idea of calling funeral homes in the Vancouver area, and one of the ones I called was a funeral home in Burnaby. And the funeral home in Burnaby was the one that had the cremation equipment in the early 1960s. So I called, and this woman said, let me think now, let me go through the records. And so she went through her registry, and sure enough, she said, yes. She said, yes, Mr. Ames, we cremated him in 1964, and yes, he should be here. Now, she said, I don't know where he is, but he should be here. Well, it became a bit of a mystery because by that time, there were literally thousands and thousands and thousands of cremations left in the storage rooms and in the storage warehouse at this funeral home in Burnaby. So it took them about 8 weeks to go through thousands and thousands and thousands of cremated containers to find the one with Mr. Ames's name on it. And he has a Assistant Commissioner Ames has a very, very prominent place in the new RCMP Memorial Cemetery at Beechwood. And his name is prominently displayed on the stone, along with the commissioner's name and mine as having taken care of him, so to speak, and got him buried. And so that is probably one of the most famous examples of a member who died and was forgotten, and yet was recovered, as many other members now are being found, like on the March West, and members on our honor roll, and vets and families and myself. We're finding our vets, and we're finding suitable places for them to be laid to rest and to be remembered.